That song was called The Village. It's also known as the anthem for the transgender community. I was on a call Wednesday or Thursday, with a number of Unitarian Universalist ministers. And we were checking in and chatting, and one of the clergy told me that, they had some spare time, as unusual as that might be, and they decided that they would take a course in studying the Bible through a transgender lens. And they were surprised. They were finding it eye-opening. And they found themselves able to see some of these passages in ways they never had before as a cisgendered, heterosexual person. Now, they didn't go into the detail about what they had learned, but I stepped back from that conversation, starting to consider what possible blinders that I have that keep me from seeing the world through a transgender lens, hearing the music of transgender voices. After this conversation with my colleague, I went into our Decentering Whiteness book club. And we too got into a conversation about seeing the world through different lenses. In our case, we were talking about the lenses of people of color. And it came down to this. In order for us to see the world through another's lens or hear it through their voices, we need to have someone like that in our lives. Someone, in this particular case, as the Decentering Whiteness group, who is not white, sharing what it was like to live in their shoes, to see the world through their eyes, to hear their song. The book we're reading in the Decentering Whiteness book club is A Black Woman's History of the United States. And one of the interesting things in this non-fiction history is that the authors, these two black women college professors, speculate throughout the book on what the feelings and motivations and thoughts might be running through the minds and hearts of these black women forebears. Their speculation drew us in as readers, helped us experience empathy as they talked about a child separated from their parent, helped us to step into what that black woman or that black child might be experiencing. I want to just pause for a second and say it's important to acknowledge that it's natural for people to see the world through their own lenses. And if you're white, we're not talking about here, I'm not talking about trying to tear down your worldview. I'm not trying to supplant it. What I'm talking about is expanding your worldview to include the worldview of others. Perhaps many different others. I've been much of the time in Unitarian Universalism, but more so recently, really working at trying to expand my worldview, in particular to encompass the experience of a trans person. How can I possibly understand what they have to endure in order to live authentically in the world? A world with so much prejudice, so much emotional and physical abuse, so many killed. How can I reach out to the trans community, knowing that so many of them have been rejected by religious institutions and so-called people of faith? How can I be an ally? Several years ago, I made a transgender friend. While we were both on this panel discussion. It's a junior high, and they brought us in to talk to the PTA about LGBTQ inclusivity, and there were probably 7 or 8 of us on this panel. And they asked us first to talk about our own experiences, both personal or as allies of the LGBTQ community. And then we offer some advice to parents who are very worried, very concerned about how to support their child if that child came out to them. There's some challenging conversations, and it was difficult for all of us on the panel to know exactly what to say. But I noticed that there was a trans woman on the panel who handled the questions with grace, with a calm presence. And so after the panel discussion was over, I went over to her and I said, I'd like to exchange business cards. I'd love to have you come out to the church. Of course, I say that to a lot of people, but and she gave me her card. And it said, President of the Cedar Rapids Chess Club. I got really excited. I hadn't played chess in years. And I asked her if I could join the club. And she said yes, and we started meeting with the other members of the club and playing chess together. And a friendship blossomed over a chessboard. I tell you this because our friendship was not based on her identity or her willingness to do activism. It was based on a common interest, on spending time with one another. Like any other friendship. Sometimes allyship looks a lot like making a friend. Camille, who was supposed to be with us but sick today, spoke with a group for me this week of clergy. And I remember one of the most important things she said as she was talking to our clergy group. She said, treat us as a person, not as a transgendered person or a LGBTQ person, but as a person. Get to know us as a person. When we come into your faith community, don't ask us to talk about being transgender. Just offer a kind word. Share a little bit about what's interesting to you, and I'll share about some things that are interesting to me. And we can get to know each other. Getting to know someone fosters connection and empathy. Getting to know someone who is not like you is what really fosters true community. Trans people are not two-dimensional characters. They're human beings, people like us, like all of us are. Also, as I prepared today, and I prepared to read you the names of the people who were killed this year, I read their stories. I felt like I had to get to know them, so they wouldn't just be a name, they'd be a person. And every story I read broke my heart. Let me read one of them to you. This is Bianca Muffin Banks, who was fatally shot by a man who later took his own life. Muffin was 30 years old. She was a former foster care child and was just beginning to blossom into herself, says Jesse Pratt Lopez, founder and co-director of the Trans Housing Coalition. And Jesse said, at a memorial vigil for Muffin, Muffin hadn't been in the apartment for even a month, and we were helping her get a job. We actually had a job interview scheduled for her the day after she died. Muffin had acquired her nickname due to her love of blueberry muffins. And she hoped to one day compete on RuPaul's Drag Race. Her friend, Angel Camarang, recalled Muffin as sweet and kind. I invite you to take a few moments, just a moment, to think about Muffin. Coming up in the foster care system, finally blossoming into herself, excited about the prospect of a new job or a new apartment. Think of her as more than a name or statistic. It's so easy in our lives. We get inundated with so much, and seeing someone who was killed, it's easy to say, I'm so sorry this happened to her. But I want you to think of her for a moment as someone you know even just a little bit, before moving on to the next thing. To linger on how it feels to have someone you know or knew to some extent be killed. And then ask yourself, what next steps might you be willing to take personally, or perhaps as a congregation, to help a transgender person, or to ensure if a transgender person came into this congregation that they would feel welcomed and safe? I want to share some ideas with you of things that you might do personally or us as a collective body to help a transgender person feel safe when they're with you, to feel welcomed, to feel of worth and value. First, avoid making any assumptions about gender identity or sexual orientation. Treat the person as a person. Treat the person as a person. Not a gender identity, not a sexual orientation, a person. Respect the person's identity and self-label and chosen name and pronouns. One way that you personally can do it, and people are beginning to do this more and more, is say your own pronouns. It opens space for them to feel safe. Do not assume that a trans person wants to speak about trans issues and only trans issues. Engage them in a conversation as you would anybody who walks into these doors or who comes into your life. If you want to learn more about transgender identity or gender diversity on your own, that's great. But recognize that person as being more than just those labels. As you talk or as up here as I do sermons, try to be aware of binary language. So instead of saying boys and girls, say children. Instead of saying men and women, say people. Instead of saying brothers and sisters, say siblings or kindred, or brothers and sisters and siblings of all genders. And talk about gender diversity with each other, with our children. With our children, provide age-appropriate education around understanding one's gender identity. And how gender roles and norms play out in our society. And we've talked about the next one. Perhaps we could move on it. Designate gender-neutral bathrooms or label the bathrooms that we have in a welcoming way. So that when a transgender person comes in, they don't have to make a decision looking at the bathrooms if they will be somehow treated poorly because of the choice they make. If you want to do social justice for trans people, learn about local and federal laws and how to change them, but follow the leadership of the local and national transgender organizations on social justice issues. My beloved people, I cannot pretend, and so I will not tell you that everything is okay, or really when it will be okay. I cannot say there is no reason to be angry and that you must be optimistic or at peace. I cannot pretend these things, and so I won't tell them to you. But I will say this. As we make our way in the world, as we continue to open our hearts to the transgender community with an awareness of the suffering that they are experiencing, we can affirm that there is love. In us and those around us, there's an abundance of love, and that we can share that love. That love that holds us. It holds us all. And that we we can be expressions of that love for any trans person that comes into our life, for any person, regardless of gender or label or if they're on marginal communities or whatever. If they walk in these doors, we can be an expression of love. We can be a community where they feel safe. I believe it. Amen.